The blood-curdling wails that pierced through the Arizona desert night on August 7, 1852, weren't the sounds of a coyote or wounded animal. The few ranchers who heard them knew they came from a young woman giving birth in a ramshackle homestead where no decent person would ever venture. This is the story of how one man's perverse interpretation of Old Testament law created a nightmare that would span 2 decades and destroy over 30 lives before anyone had the courage to speak against him. Nathaniel Bowden didn't just break his family. He rebuilt it according to his own twisted vision, where sisters became wives, brothers became husbands, and the very concept of natural bonds was corrupted beyond recognition. What began as one man's depravity in the isolated Sonoran wilderness would eventually reveal itself as America's most disturbing case of familial corruption, challenging everything the young nation thought it understood about the limits of human evil. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steady drip of water through cracked adobe walls, the suffocating smell of unwashed bodies mixed with desert dust, the rough texture of sun-bleached timber that had never known proper carpentry. These were the sensations that greeted the rare visitor to the Bowden settlement in the barren stretches of southern Arizona territory. Tucked into a canyon so remote the nearest town of Tucson lay 47 miles to the north, the property existed in a void where civilized law had never quite reached, and where the brutal logic of survival often trumped moral consideration. Nathaniel Bowden had claimed this desolate land in 1847, shortly after the death of his wife Martha during a cholera outbreak that had swept through their wagon train. A man who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall with eyes the color of desert sand that seemed to look into a person's soul rather than at their face, Nathaniel possessed what the few traders who'd encountered him described as a presence that made even hardened frontiermen uneasy in his shadow. He'd arrived in Arizona from Missouri carrying little more than a battered Bible, a leather pouch of gold coins, and 4 young people whose mother had supposedly succumbed to disease according to God's divine timing. The Bowden group consisted of Nathaniel's daughter Autumn, age 13, his son Cole, age 11, and 2 others he introduced as his wards, a young woman named Sienna, age 15, and her brother Weston, age 14. These 4 souls had never known existence beyond Nathaniel's dominion, and the coming years would reveal just how complete that dominion had become. Nathaniel educated them himself, using only scripture and a collection of theological texts that emphasized divine selection, patriarchal supremacy, and absolute submission to God's earthly representatives. But his understanding of these holy words twisted familiar passages into justifications for practices that would have horrified even the most rigid frontier preachers who occasionally passed through the territory. By 1850, the Bowden settlement had transformed into something that resembled a fortified compound more than a simple homestead. Nathaniel had constructed additional structures using adobe and salvaged timber, creating a cluster of buildings that now housed not only his original group but also several young women who'd arrived under circumstances that the few neighboring ranchers found increasingly troubling. These women, ranging in age from 15 to 23, were presented as spiritual daughters and servants of the Lord, but their fearful demeanor and obvious pregnancies suggested relationships that violated both territorial law and Christian teaching. The isolated nature of the settlement made verification of rumors nearly impossible, but whispers had begun to spread among the scattered desert communities about the strange household arrangements at the Bowden place. Power corrupts absolutely when darkness provides cover. The first documented concern about conditions at the Bowden settlement came from Dr. Samuel Abbott, a physician traveling the territory who'd been summoned to treat what Nathaniel described as female troubles in July of 1851. Dr. Abbott's private medical journal, discovered years later among his effects, provides the earliest detailed account of what he witnessed during that visit. The women in Bowden's household display signs of severe malnourishment and psychological distress that I have previously observed only in prisoners held under barbaric conditions. They speak only when directly addressed, refuse to meet the eyes of any man, and exhibit extreme anxiety when approached. Most alarming, several are clearly with babies, despite claims that no men outside the household have visited the property in over a year. Dr. Abbott noted particular concern about Autumn Bowden, now 17 and heavily pregnant with what would be her second delivery. When he attempted to conduct a private medical examination, Nathaniel insisted on remaining present, claiming that his spiritual authority over his daughters required his oversight of any medical procedures performed on them. The doctor's journal entry from that day contains an observation that would prove prophetic. Autumn Bowden addresses her father with terms that suggest confusion about his role in her life. She called him both Papa and husband, within the span of our brief conversation, seemingly unaware that such language might strike an outsider as deeply inappropriate. When I inquired about the father of her unborn, she simply gestured toward Nathaniel and smiled as though discussing nothing more significant than the weather patterns. The remoteness of the Bolton settlement made investigation of rumors practically impossible. But by late 1851, stories about Nathaniel's peculiar household had begun circulating among the scattered ranching communities and mining camps that dotted the Arizona Territory. Some claimed he'd established a religious commune based on ancient Hebrew practices of multiple wives. Others whispered that he'd simply lost his sanity after his wife's death and was living out fantasies of biblical patriarchy in the lawless desert wilderness. What none of the frontier gossip suspected was that Nathaniel Bowden had created something far more sinister than a commune or polygamous arrangement. He'd established a kingdom where his word carried the weight of divine law, where his interpretation of Scripture justified any action, and where his own offspring had become both subjects and breeding stock for his corrupted vision of righteous authority. The isolation of the settlement served Nathaniel's purposes perfectly. In the Arizona Territory of the early 1850s, law enforcement consisted of occasional visits from federal marshals, more concerned with Apache raids and claim disputes than with the domestic arrangements of isolated homesteaders. The nearest territorial judge sat in Tucson, and his jurisdiction extended over an area larger than some eastern states, making regular oversight of remote settlements impossible. If this story has already disturbed you, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Hit that subscribe button because what Nathaniel Bowden did to maintain his control over his household makes this introduction seem tame by comparison. The first official inquiry into the Bowden settlement wouldn't come for another 18 months, triggered by the disappearance of a circuit preacher who'd made the fatal mistake of challenging Nathaniel's theological interpretations during what should have been a routine pastoral visit. But by then, the body count had already begun to accumulate in the unforgiving Arizona soil, and the true scope of Nathaniel's crimes would prove far more extensive than anyone had imagined. What drives a man to transform his own family into instruments of his perverted will? How did he maintain absolute control over a growing household of traumatized women and their offspring? And most disturbing of all, why did it take so long for anyone to intervene when evidence of his crimes was hiding in plain sight beneath the brutal desert sun? The answers lay buried in the Arizona Territory, waiting for someone brave enough to dig beneath decades of willful ignorance and uncover the truth about one of the American frontier's most disturbing patriarchs. The leather-bound journal that Nathaniel Bowden kept hidden in a locked chest beneath his sleeping quarters contained handwritten sermons that would have made the most hardened frontiersman recoil in disgust. Each entry meticulously outlined how biblical passages could be reinterpreted to justify the systematic abuse of those under his care. This documentation would later reveal how calculating predators use religion as both weapon and shield to commit unspeakable acts while maintaining their own sense of divine righteousness. The scratch of a steel pen nib on rough paper late into desert nights, the acrid scent of tallow candles mixed with leather and tobacco, the smooth texture of pages filled with increasingly disturbed theological reasoning. These were the elements that surrounded Nathaniel's private study sessions during the winter of 1851. While his household slept in the surrounding structures, Nathaniel spent hours crafting religious arguments that would justify behaviors he knew the outside world would condemn as abominations against nature. His journal entries from this period, recovered during the eventual investigation, provide chilling insight into the mental processes of a man who'd convinced himself that God had chosen him for a special purpose that superseded normal moral law. The entry dated November 18, 1851, exemplifies his twisted logic. The Lord blessed Abraham with Sarah, yet also provided Hagar as a vessel for his seed when Sarah proved barren. If the patriarch of nations could know his servant as wife, surely the chosen father of a new covenant may sanctify his own blood in similar fashion. Are not my offspring given to me by divine providence to use according to his holy will? The laws of men are but shadows compared to the eternal laws revealed to those chosen to receive them. Nathaniel's interpretation of Scripture focused heavily on Old Testament passages about patriarchal authority, divine selection, and the special dispensations that applied to God's chosen representatives. He developed elaborate theological explanations for why normal moral restrictions didn't apply to him, creating a personal religion that positioned him as both father and husband to his female offspring, while casting his sons as future patriarchs who would continue the bloodline according to his perverted vision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The physical evidence of his beliefs could be seen throughout the settlement by early 1852. Wooden crosses carved with biblical verses about obedience and submission decorated every structure. Hand-copied scripture passages about patriarchal authority were nailed to walls where the women would see them constantly. And most disturbing of all, Nathaniel had constructed what he called a sanctification chamber, a small adobe building where he conducted private religious ceremonies that he claimed were necessary to maintain his daughters' spiritual purity and prepare them for their sacred duties. Some men build altars to worship God, others build them to become gods themselves. The first detailed account of these ceremonies comes from testimony given years later by Sienna, who escaped the compound at age 19. According to her statement to territorial authorities, the sanctification rituals followed a consistent pattern that combined religious symbolism with systematic violation. Papa Nathaniel would summon us to the special room one at a time, usually when we first experienced our monthly courses, or when he said the Lord had revealed we were ready for blessing. He'd read from his special book, not the regular Bible, but one he'd written himself with his own interpretations, and tell us how we were chosen vessels for God's work on earth. Then he'd make us drink something bitter that tasted of herbs, and made everything become hazy and distant. When we regained our full senses, he'd tell us we were sanctified and blessed to carry out the Lord's divine will through our bodies. The settlement's isolation made Nathaniel's control nearly absolute, but he also employed psychological manipulation techniques that would be recognized today as sophisticated forms of cult indoctrination. Young people born into the household knew no other reality than their father's twisted interpretation of divine authority. They were taught that the outside world was filled with sinners and savages who would corrupt and destroy them if given the chance, and that Nathaniel's protection was the only barrier standing between them and eternal damnation. Nathaniel reinforced this isolation through carefully controlled information and deliberate confusion about family relationships. Young ones weren't told who their biological mothers were, instead being taught that all the women in the compound were their sisters in Christ and that Nathaniel was the only parent who truly mattered in God's eyes. This system created deep psychological dependency, while making it nearly impossible for them to understand that their living situation was profoundly abnormal. What would you do if everyone you trusted told you that evil was holiness? By early 1852, the compound housed 19 people. Nathaniel, 9 women between the ages of 15 and 26, and 9 young ones ranging from infants to 12 years old. The women were all either pregnant or nursing, creating a cycle of childbirth that served both Nathaniel's desires and his vision of building a dynasty that would spread his influence throughout the Arizona territory and beyond. The only man who dared challenge this arrangement during this period was Reverend Dominic Shaw, a Methodist circuit preacher who'd heard disturbing rumors about the Bowden settlement and decided to investigate personally. Shaw arrived at the compound on February 19, 1852, intending to offer spiritual guidance and assess whether intervention was needed. According to Shaw's journal, which survived his disappearance, Nathaniel initially welcomed him with elaborate hospitality, providing food, shelter, and extensive theological discussions about patriarchal authority in biblical times. But when Shaw suggested that some of Nathaniel's interpretations might be excessively liberal and that the household arrangements seemed contrary to Christian marriage customs, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Shaw's final journal entry, dated February 21, 1852, reads, "Bowden has become increasingly hostile to my questions about his family structure. When I suggested he might benefit from guidance from properly ordained ministers in Tucson, he claimed that God speaks to him directly through visions. and that no earthly authority has the right to question his divine mandate. Most disturbing, he referred to his daughters as his wives, without any apparent awareness that such language might be deeply inappropriate. I fear this man has descended into dangerous madness, but the isolation of his property makes intervention extraordinarily difficult. I plan to report these concerns to the territorial marshal upon my return to Tucson. Reverend Shaw was never seen alive again after that entry. His horse was found 5 days later wandering loose near the main trail with its saddle torn and blood-stained. When concerned parishioners eventually reached the territorial marshal's office in Tucson, they were told that Shaw had probably fallen victim to Apache raiders or bandits while traveling the dangerous desert roads, a common enough occurrence in the lawless territory. But Nathaniel's journal tells a different story. In an entry dated February 22, 1852, he wrote, "The false prophet who came to challenge God's chosen servant has been removed according to divine instruction revealed to me in a vision. His corruption will not be allowed to spread among the sanctified. The Lord protects his own from those who would interfere with his holy work." The murder of Reverend Shaw marked a turning point in Nathaniel's evolution from religious extremist to something far more dangerous. He'd discovered that he could eliminate threats to his authority with complete impunity, protected by the settlement's isolation and the unwillingness of territorial authorities to investigate disappearances in the remote desert regions where Apache raids and bandit attacks provided convenient explanations for missing persons. With this knowledge, Nathaniel began planning expansion of his operation, envisioning a network of settlements throughout the Arizona Territory where his interpretation of divine authority would reign supreme and where his bloodline would proliferate without interference from the corrupt outside world that had rejected God's true teachings. The disappearance of 18-year-old Julia Patterson from the Tubac trading post on May 3, 1852, followed the same pattern as 9 other missing young women throughout southern Arizona Territory. All were young. All were traveling with minimal supervision, and all had last been seen talking to a tall, well-dressed man with sandy hair and unsettling eyes, who claimed to be a traveling minister seeking workers for a Christian household. What these families didn't know was that their daughters weren't victims of random tragedy or Apache raids. They were carefully selected recruits for Nathaniel Bowden's expanding kingdom of horror, chosen with the calculated precision of a man who understood both human psychology and the vulnerabilities of isolated frontier communities. The creak of wagon wheels on rutted desert trails, the sweet scent of mesquite blooming along dry creek beds, the rough texture of hemp rope hidden beneath canvas tarps. These were the elements that accompanied Nathaniel's hunting expeditions as he traveled the remote valleys and trading posts of the territory in search of new additions to his household. Unlike random predators who stalk the frontier, Nathaniel operated with methodical precision. His selection criteria were coldly practical and deeply calculated. He targeted young women between 15 and 19 who came from families struggling with poverty or recent tragedy. Orphans were strongly preferred, but those from large families where one missing person might not be immediately noticed also proved suitable. Most importantly, he sought young women who possessed what he called spiritual receptivity, a combination of desperation, innocence, and isolation that made them susceptible to his theological manipulations. Julia Patterson exemplified his ideal victim profile. The eldest daughter of a widowed rancher who'd lost his wife and 2 sons to fever the previous summer, Julia had been forced to assume adult responsibilities while still grieving her own losses. When Nathaniel approached her outside the trading post in Tubac, he presented himself as Brother Nathaniel, a traveling minister who'd been moved by God to help families struggling with hardship in the brutal territory. Predators always disguise themselves as saviors until the trap closes. According to witness testimony gathered years later, Nathaniel's initial conversation with Julia followed his established pattern of recruitment. He expressed deep sympathy for her family's losses, quoted scripture about God's special care for orphans and widows, and gradually introduced the concept that some young women were called to serve in special households, where they could receive proper spiritual education while helping care for other believers in need of guidance. The conversation took place over several days, with Nathaniel returning to the trading post repeatedly to build trust and deepen Julia's sense that divine providence had brought them together. He spoke of his remote settlement as a place of safety and spiritual growth where young women could escape the corruption and violence of frontier society while serving God's purposes in a pure environment protected from worldly sin. On May 3rd, Julia left her father a note explaining that she'd been called to serve in a Christian household and would write soon with details about her new situation. She was never seen in Tubac again, but her father received a single letter 3 weeks later, written in his daughter's handwriting but containing language and theological concepts far beyond her limited education. The letter described her happiness in her new home and her gratitude for being chosen to serve God's will in such a blessed environment. What Julia's father didn't know was that the letter had been dictated by Nathaniel and written under the influence of the same herbal concoctions he used during his sanctification ceremonies. By the time Julia regained full awareness of her true situation, she was already pregnant and psychologically dependent on the man who'd destroyed her previous life, while convincing her it was God's sacred will. The recruitment process itself represented sophisticated psychological manipulation that modern experts would recognize as textbook cult indoctrination. Nathaniel isolated his targets from their support systems, created artificial crises that required his intervention, and gradually replaced their original belief systems with his twisted theology. By the time his victims realized the true nature of their situation, they were too traumatized and dependent to consider escape as a realistic possibility. Dr. Margaret Thornton's 1889 study of cult recruitment patterns, while conducted decades after Nathaniel's crimes, provides insight into the psychological mechanisms he employed. Successful cult leaders target individuals during periods of transition or trauma, when normal decision-making processes are compromised by emotional distress. They present themselves as sources of stability and meaning while systematically undermining their victims' connections to external reality and alternative perspectives. What would you do if salvation looked exactly like slavery? The settlement's population had grown to 26 people by summer of 1852, including Nathaniel, 14 women and young ladies, and 11 offspring. The logistics of maintaining such a large household in the harsh Arizona desert required careful planning and considerable resources, both of which Nathaniel obtained through methods that extended far beyond simple recruitment of new wives. His financial resources came primarily from the systematic robbery and murder of travelers who made the fatal mistake of seeking shelter at the settlement. Nathaniel had carefully established the homestead's reputation as a place where weary travelers could find Christian hospitality, advertising this service in nearby towns and posting notices at trading posts throughout the Southern Territory. What visitors found instead was a carefully orchestrated system of exploitation that culminated in their disappearance and the acquisition of their possessions, livestock, and any valuables they carried. The murder of Thomas Burke, a cattle buyer from Texas, on July 12, 1852 exemplifies Nathaniel's methods. Burke had arrived at the settlement with a substantial sum of money from recent livestock sales, intending to spend one night before continuing to Tucson. According to Nathaniel's journal, Burke was treated to an elaborate welcome feast, during which his food was laced with sedatives derived from desert plants that Nathaniel had learned to prepare through careful experimentation. The merchant Burke proved resistant to the Lord's mercy, Nathaniel wrote. His questioning of our household arrangements and his obvious disapproval of God's chosen structure required swift correction according to divine instruction. His possessions will serve the righteous cause he sought to hinder with his worldly judgments. Burke's body was buried in what Nathaniel called the sanctification ground, a hidden cemetery behind the settlement where the remains of at least 23 people would eventually be discovered. His horse and wagon were dismantled and hidden, while his money and goods were distributed among the household according to Nathaniel's interpretation of biblical principles about the spoils of righteous warfare. The pattern of hospitality followed by murder served multiple purposes beyond simple financial gain. It reinforced Nathaniel's control over his household by demonstrating the consequences of challenging his authority, while also eliminating potential witnesses who might report the settlement's existence to outside authorities. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Nathaniel had begun training his older sons to participate in these killings, teaching them that the elimination of corrupted outsiders was both a religious duty and a practical necessity for protecting their sanctified community from contamination by the sinful world. Cole Bowden, now 16 years old, had been explicitly instructed in what his father called the sacred duty of protection. Nathaniel's journal contains detailed entries about teaching his son the proper methods for subduing travelers, the most effective poisons derived from local plants, and the theological justifications that made such killings not merely acceptable, but holy acts in service of God's divine plan. By the end of summer 1852, the Bowden settlement had evolved from a single family's tragedy into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that combined religious extremism, systematic violation, and calculated murder into a system that could theoretically operate indefinitely without detection. But Nathaniel's success had also bred dangerous overconfidence, and his expanding operations would soon attract the attention of someone who couldn't be eliminated as easily as a traveling preacher or an isolated cattle buyer. The question was whether territorial authorities could move quickly enough to prevent Nathaniel from either escaping justice or eliminating the evidence and witnesses necessary to convict him of crimes that challenged the legal system's understanding of human depravity in the lawless American frontier. The bare feet that ran through 18 miles of Arizona desert on the scorching afternoon of September 14, 1852, left bloody prints in the sand that told a story no civilized mind wanted to believe. Behind those footprints lay the settlement where 19-year-old Sienna had endured 5 years of systematic horror. What Sienna carried in her memory would become the first eyewitness account of Nathaniel Bowden's crimes. But getting anyone to believe her testimony would prove almost as difficult as escaping his compound had been. The searing heat of desert sand on exposed skin, the metallic taste of blood from cracked lips, the sharp edges of volcanic rock that cut bare feet with each desperate step. These were the sensations that accompanied Sienna's flight from the only home she'd known since Nathaniel had claimed her and her brother Weston as his wards back in Missouri. She'd been 10 then, an orphan whose parents had died of fever, and Nathaniel had presented himself as a godly man willing to provide Christian education and proper upbringing. Sienna's escape had been planned for months, triggered by Nathaniel's announcement that her younger brother Weston, now 18, would soon participate in a divine union ceremony with Autumn Bowden, who was simultaneously Weston's adoptive sister and Nathaniel's daughter-wife. Having witnessed similar ceremonies involving other members of the household, Sienna understood that this formal recognition meant permanent entrapment for her brother and the continuation of Nathaniel's corrupted bloodline into another generation. The opportunity came during a supply trip to Tucson that required most of the men to leave the settlement for 3 days. While the household operated under reduced supervision, Sienna slipped away during the pre-dawn hours, when even the guard dogs were still sleeping in whatever shade they could find from the relentless desert heat. Freedom costs everything when everything has already been taken. Her journey to the nearest ranch took nearly 7 hours through brutal heat and treacherous terrain. By the time she reached the property of Jacob Stone, a former soldier who'd established a small cattle operation 12 miles from the settlement, Sienna was suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion that would leave her bedridden for nearly a week. But she was alive, and more importantly, she was free to tell her story to anyone who would listen. Stone's initial reaction typified the response Sienna would encounter throughout her attempts to seek justice. As recorded in his statement to authorities, Stone found her claims too fantastic for belief and suspected she might be suffering from sun sickness, brought on by exposure and delirium. The young woman spoke of things no decent person should have knowledge about, Stone later testified. She described ceremonies that sounded more like pagan rituals than Christian practice, and claimed that Brother Bowden, a man I'd met twice at the trading post, and who seemed perfectly respectable, was living as husband to his own daughter. Such accusations seemed a product of a mind damaged by the desert sun, rather than truthful testimony about actual events. Sienna's credibility problems extended beyond the shocking nature of her allegations. She'd been isolated from normal society for 5 years, during which time Nathaniel's psychological manipulation had left her with speech patterns and behavioral peculiarities that made her appear unstable to outsiders. She spoke in biblical language that sounded rehearsed and unnatural, flinched at sudden movements, and demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure scripture that seemed impossible for an uneducated 19-year-old woman. When Stone finally agreed to escort Sienna to Tucson to meet with territorial authorities, her encounter with Marshal Henry Grant produced equally frustrating results. Grant, a practical man more concerned with Apache raids and mining claim disputes than complex domestic situations, found Sienna's story too elaborate for belief and suggested she might be seeking attention or revenge against a family that had provided her with shelter and sustenance in the harsh territory. Young women sometimes develop fanciful notions about their circumstances, Marshall Grant noted in his official report. Miss Sienna appears to have been adequately fed and clothed during her time with the Bowden family, which contradicts her claims of mistreatment and abuse. Her inability to provide specific dates or witnesses for many of her allegations raises serious questions about the reliability of her testimony and her true motivations for making such serious accusations. What would you do if the truth sounded exactly like madness? The problem wasn't just skepticism about Sienna's specific claims. It was the broader unwillingness of Arizona Territory society in 1852 to acknowledge that such systematic evil could exist within their communities. The territory was still recovering from the recent war with Mexico, struggling with Apache conflicts, and dealing with the massive influx of fortune seekers heading to California goldfields. Territorial authorities had neither the resources nor the inclination to investigate complex domestic situations based on the testimony of what appeared to be an unstable young woman with possible grudges against her benefactors. Sienna's frustration with official indifference led her to seek help from religious authorities, reasoning that church leaders would be more receptive to testimony about religiously motivated crimes. Her meeting with Reverend Austin Ford of the Tucson Presbyterian Church on September 28, 1852, initially seemed more promising than her encounters with secular authorities. Reverend Ford's private journal, discovered after his death in 1887, reveals his internal struggle with Sienna's testimony. The young woman speaks with troubling conviction about matters that would represent the most serious violations of Christian doctrine imaginable. Yet her knowledge of Scripture is remarkably sophisticated for someone of her limited education, and her descriptions of Bowden's theological reasoning demonstrate familiarity with actual biblical interpretation, albeit twisted to serve ungodly purposes. If her accusations contain even a kernel of truth, we face evil of a magnitude that challenges one's faith in human decency and divine justice. Despite his private concerns, Reverend Ford ultimately chose not to pursue formal action against Nathaniel. His journal entries from September and October of 1852 reveal a man torn between moral obligation and practical considerations. To accuse a fellow Christian of such depravity without irrefutable proof would violate the commandment against bearing false witness and could destroy an innocent man's reputation. Yet to ignore testimony that might represent genuine cries for help would violate the commandment to protect the innocent and vulnerable. I find myself paralyzed between these competing moral imperatives, unable to determine which path serves God's will more faithfully. The religious community's failure to act reflected broader social dynamics that protected men like Nathaniel from accountability. In a society where patriarchal authority was considered divinely ordained, and where family matters were viewed as private concerns beyond outside interference, accusations of domestic wrongdoing, even abuse as extreme as Sienna described, were often dismissed as exaggerations, misunderstandings, or outright fabrications by ungrateful dependents. If you're disturbed by what you're hearing, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets significantly darker as Nathaniel's confidence grows and his crimes escalate beyond anything the territory had seen before. Sienna's final attempt to seek justice came through a letter-writing campaign to territorial officials in Prescott, where she hoped that administrators with broader perspective and greater resources might take her allegations seriously. Her letter to Territorial Governor John Goodwin, dated October 15, 1852, provides the most detailed written account of conditions at the Bowden settlement. Your Excellency, I write to report crimes against Christian decency and territorial law occurring in the remote sections near the Mexican border. The man known as Nathaniel Bowden has established what he calls a sanctified household, where young women are held against their will and forced to submit to ungodly practices disguised as religious ceremonies. I have personally witnessed the murder of travelers who sought shelter at the settlement, and I have seen their bodies buried in ground Bowden claims is sanctified by God's will. I beg your intervention before more innocent souls are corrupted, destroyed, or forced into arrangements that violate both natural law and divine commandment. Governor Goodwin's response, if any was ever sent, has not survived in historical records. But Sienna's letter was filed away in territorial archives, where it would remain unread for decades while Nathaniel continued his crimes with complete impunity. protected by isolation, official indifference, and a society unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths about the darkness that could flourish in the lawless frontier. By autumn of 1852, Siena had exhausted every avenue for official justice and was forced to accept that her testimony alone would never be sufficient to challenge Nathaniel's expanding empire of abuse. But her escape had accomplished something nearly as important as immediate intervention. It had established a precedent that resistance was possible, and it had created the first documented record of crimes that would eventually demand a reckoning. The question now was whether anyone else would find the courage to follow Siena's example, or whether Nathaniel's kingdom of horror would continue to grow unchallenged in the remote Arizona desert, where civilized law had barely taken root, and where the brutal logic of survival often trumped moral consideration. Meanwhile, back at the settlement, Nathaniel had interpreted Siena's escape not as a warning to curtail his activities, but as evidence that he needed to strengthen his control and accelerate his expansion plans before outside interference could threaten the sacred work he believed God had called him to accomplish in the wilderness. The town of Tubac received 14 reports of missing young women between 1852 and 1854, yet not a single official investigation was ever opened by territorial authorities. When concerned families pressed for action, they were told that young women often ran off with minors or traders, and that frontier families sometimes got ideas about pursuing better opportunities elsewhere. What these families discovered was that their community's willingness to ignore obvious patterns of disappearance made them complicit in crimes they refused to acknowledge. The hollow sound of a judge's gavel dismissing yet another missing person case, the musty smell of legal documents filed away unread in dusty territorial offices, the worn wooden benches where desperate families sat waiting for justice that would never arrive. These were the elements that defined the Tucson courthouse during the years when Nathaniel Bowden's crimes reached their terrifying peak. By 1853, the pattern of young women vanishing from surrounding communities had become so routine that territorial authorities had developed standardized responses designed to discourage further inquiry rather than promote investigation. Judge Miles Abbott, who presided over territorial legal proceedings from 1850 to 1858, established policies that effectively protected predators like Nathaniel from scrutiny. His court records reveal a systematic pattern of dismissing missing person cases involving young women as domestic matters beyond legal jurisdiction or voluntary departures not requiring official intervention. The assumption was always that these were adult women exercising their freedom to leave their families and seek their fortunes elsewhere in the vast territory. The case of 20-year-old Kendall Harper exemplified this willful blindness. Kendall had disappeared from her family's ranch on June 8, 1853, after telling her sister she was going to meet a preacher who promised to find her honorable work in a Christian household where she could earn money to send back to her struggling family. When Kendall's father attempted to file a formal complaint with territorial authorities, he was told that adults had the right to leave their families without permission, and that the court couldn't investigate every case of young people seeking their fortunes in the growing territory. Justice sleeps when communities choose comfort over truth. Kendall's father, William Harper, refused to accept this dismissal and conducted his own investigation. His efforts led him to 4 other families in the region, who'd lost daughters under strikingly similar circumstances. All had spoken to the same tall, well-dressed man, who claimed to represent Christian households seeking domestic workers and spiritual companions. All had received a single letter after their daughters' departures, written in familiar handwriting but containing suspiciously sophisticated theological language. When Harper attempted to present this evidence to Judge Abbott, he was told that coincidences don't constitute crimes, and that speculation about traveling preachers wasn't sufficient grounds for legal action or the allocation of scarce territorial resources. The judge's reluctance to investigate reflected broader social dynamics that protected men like Nathaniel from accountability. In post-Mexican War Arizona territory, law enforcement resources were focused on more visible threats like Apache raids, Mexican bandit incursions, and mining claim disputes. Domestic situations involving isolated homesteads were considered low priority, especially when the alleged perpetrator was a white man with apparent religious credentials and no previous criminal record. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a pioneering female physician who traveled circuit routes throughout southern Arizona, documented these attitudes in her professional journal with growing frustration. The systematic disappearance of young women from desert communities represents a crisis that territorial authorities refuse to acknowledge. When I raised concerns about suspicious patterns during my rounds through various settlements, I was told that such matters were beyond a woman's understanding, and that my medical training didn't qualify me to make observations about criminal activity or law enforcement priorities. The community's willful blindness extended beyond official indifference to active suppression of evidence and witness testimony. When Sienna attempted to organize other families who'd lost daughters, she encountered coordinated resistance from both religious and secular authorities, who viewed her activism as disruptive to social order and potentially damaging to the territory's reputation among potential settlers. Reverend Gavin Doyle of the Tubac Methodist Church made this attitude explicit in a sermon delivered on August 17, 1853. Certain individuals have chosen to spread tales of wickedness and corruption among our Christian community. Such gossip serves only to undermine faith and sow discord among believers who should be united in building civilization in this harsh land. We must resist the temptation to credit wild stories that cast suspicion on godly men simply because their households may differ from conventional arrangements. The frontier requires flexibility in domestic arrangements, and we must not judge those who organize their families according to biblical principles rather than modern conventions. What would you do if everyone you trusted called evil good? The sermon was widely understood as a direct response to Sienna's efforts to document the pattern of disappearances and warn other families about Nathaniel's recruitment methods. Reverend Doyle's warning effectively silenced most community discussion about missing women, as families feared social ostracism and potential business consequences if they appeared to support gossip that challenged respected religious leaders and established settlers. This conspiracy of silence was reinforced by economic considerations that made challenging Nathaniel's activities financially dangerous for local residents. The Bowden settlement had become a significant source of trade for the region, purchasing supplies, livestock, and equipment from dozens of local ranchers, merchants, and craftsmen. Nathaniel's apparent wealth, derived from robbing and murdering his victims, made him an important customer whose business many families couldn't afford to lose in the struggling territorial economy. Henry Patterson, who operated the general store and trading post in Tubac, explicitly acknowledged this dynamic in his private correspondence with his brother back east. Brother Bowden's orders keep our business profitable during lean months when other customers are scarce. While I've heard whispers about unusual arrangements at his homestead, I cannot afford to investigate rumors that might cost us his considerable patronage. My family's welfare depends on maintaining good relationships with all our customers, regardless of their private affairs or domestic arrangements. The pattern of economic dependency created a web of complicity that extended throughout the desert communities. Farmers who sold livestock to Nathaniel, merchants who provided supplies, craftsmen who did occasional work at the settlement, and even clergy who accepted his generous donations, all had financial incentives to avoid asking uncomfortable questions about the source of his resources or the nature of his household arrangements. This economic protection was supplemented by Nathaniel's careful cultivation of his public image as a devout Christian and community benefactor. He made regular donations to local churches, provided assistance to struggling families during hard times, and presented himself as a living example of how biblical prosperity rewarded righteous living and faithful adherence to God's commandments. His reputation as a man blessed by God made accusations against him seem not just implausible but almost blasphemous, an attack on divine judgment itself. How could a man so obviously favored by providence be guilty of the monstrous crimes Sienna described? The effectiveness of this strategy was demonstrated in November of 1853 when Julia Patterson's father finally received reliable information about his daughter's whereabouts. A traveling merchant had spotted Julia at the Bowden settlement and reported that she appeared to be living there as one of Nathaniel's wives, heavily pregnant and dressed in the plain clothing that all the settlement women wore. When Patterson confronted territorial authorities with this information, he was told that his daughter was an adult who'd chosen her own circumstances and that any attempt to interfere with Brother Bowden's household would be viewed as harassment of a respected citizen and possibly as religious persecution. Marshall Grant's response to Patterson's complaint reveals the extent to which official authority had been co-opted to protect Nathaniel. Mr. Bowden has explained to me on previous occasions that he operates a Christian commune where young people can receive proper spiritual education while contributing to a godly household organized according to biblical principles. If your daughter has chosen to join such an arrangement, that is her right as an adult woman. I will not authorize official interference with legitimate religious practices based on a father's displeasure with his daughter's choices or his disagreement with her spiritual convictions. By 1854, the system of willful blindness surrounding Nathaniel's crimes had become so institutionalized that families stopped reporting disappearances altogether. The message from authority figures was unmistakably clear. Young women who vanished were responsible for their own fates, and attempts to investigate their disappearances would be viewed as troublemaking rather than legitimate concern for public safety. This collective failure of moral courage created the perfect environment for Nathaniel's crimes to escalate beyond anything the territory had yet witnessed. Protected by a community that chose economic convenience over justice and social stability over truth, he began planning the most ambitious phase of his criminal enterprise: the establishment of multiple settlements throughout the Arizona territory that would spread his influence far beyond the confines of a single isolated homestead. But Nathaniel's confidence in his community's complicity would soon be tested by events that even the most willfully blind authorities couldn't ignore forever. The question was whether justice would arrive in time to prevent the ultimate corruption of his vision, the creation of a second generation fully indoctrinated into his twisted theology and prepared to spread his interpretation of divine authority throughout the frontier. The marriage certificate, dated March 22, 1854, bore the signature of Autumn Bowden, who had just turned 26 as she wed her adoptive brother Weston, age 20, in a ceremony performed by her father-husband Nathaniel. The document, discovered decades later in territorial archives, represented the horrific culmination of Nathaniel's twisted dynasty. This wasn't just intergenerational abuse anymore. It was the systematic creation of a bloodline so corrupted that victims became perpetrators, and young people grew up believing that violations of natural law were divine commandments. The sweet scent of desert wildflowers blooming outside the makeshift chapel. The rough texture of hand-hewn benches where a congregation of the damned gathered to witness abomination. The hollow sound of hymns sung by voices that had forgotten what genuine joy meant. These were the elements that surrounded the ceremony that marked Nathaniel's ultimate triumph over human decency and natural order. In 7 years of systematic evil, he had achieved something that would have made the devil himself take notice. He'd created young people who viewed their own corruption as holy sacrament, who couldn't distinguish between divine love and demonic possession, and who were now prepared to perpetuate his vision into future generations without any external coercion. Weston had never known life outside Nathaniel's dominion. Brought into the household at age 10 after his parents died, he'd been raised according to Nathaniel's interpretation of biblical patriarchy from his earliest memories under the man's care. By age 20, Weston stood nearly 6 feet tall with the same unsettling intensity in his eyes that Nathaniel possessed, and an already developing talent for the kind of theological manipulation that Nathaniel had perfected over years of corrupting scripture to serve his purposes. The ceremony itself followed rituals that Nathaniel had developed through years of corrupting traditional Christian marriage practices into something unrecognizable. Unlike normal weddings, this one included elements that would have horrified any legitimate minister: vows that explicitly referenced the bride's duty to produce offspring for the continuation of the sanctified bloodline, and biblical readings that focused exclusively on Old Testament passages about patriarchal authority, divine selection, and the special dispensations granted to God's chosen servants. Evil breeds itself when given enough time and isolation. Autumn's participation in her own adoptive brother's wedding represented the complete psychological destruction that Nathaniel had achieved through years of systematic manipulation. According to testimony given years later by escaped family members, Autumn genuinely believed that marrying Weston was both her religious duty and the natural progression of relationships within their sanctified household. She'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated that she couldn't conceive of normal family structures as anything other than corrupted deviations from God's intended plan for humanity. The wedding was witnessed by 34 people, including Nathaniel's other wives, their offspring, and several recent recruits who were still undergoing the psychological conditioning that would transform them from victims into accomplices. For the newer arrivals, the ceremony served as both celebration and warning. It demonstrated the ultimate destination of Nathaniel's program, while showing them what their own futures would become if they remained in the settlement and accepted their assigned roles in his grand design. Dr. James Harrison's 1891 study of cult psychology, while conducted decades after these events, provides insight into the mechanisms that made such systematic corruption possible. Prolonged isolation, combined with religious indoctrination, can fundamentally alter an individual's understanding of normal human relationships and natural boundaries. When young people are raised from earliest memory within systems that present aberrant behavior as divinely mandated, they lack the psychological framework necessary to recognize abuse or conceive of alternatives. The cult environment becomes their entire reality, and the cult leader's interpretation of morality becomes indistinguishable from absolute truth. Following the wedding, Weston was formally inducted into what Nathaniel called the Council of Patriarchs, a governing body that would oversee the expansion of their operation beyond the original settlement. This council included Nathaniel himself, Weston, and two other young men who'd reached what Nathaniel considered the age of spiritual maturity and readiness for leadership responsibilities. Together, they began planning the establishment of satellite settlements throughout the Arizona territory that would spread their influence while reducing the risk of detection that came with housing too many people in a single location. The first satellite settlement was established in May of 1854 on property that Nathaniel had purchased using money stolen from murdered travelers. Located 23 miles from the original homestead, in an even more remote canyon, this second location was designed to house younger members and newer recruits who were still undergoing psychological conditioning and weren't yet fully trusted to maintain the necessary secrecy about the operation. Weston was placed in charge of this facility with explicit instructions to implement the same systems of control and indoctrination that had proven so effective at the main settlement. His responsibilities included recruiting new members, conducting sanctification ceremonies, eliminating threats when necessary, and ensuring that the satellite operation remained completely hidden from territorial authorities and curious outsiders. What would you do if your own victims worshipped your crimes as holy acts? Weston's management of the satellite settlement demonstrated that Nathaniel's corruption had successfully reproduced itself in the second generation with horrifying efficiency. Within 6 months, Weston had recruited 5 young women from surrounding communities using the same theological manipulation techniques his adoptive father had perfected, but with innovations that reflected his own twisted creativity and his generation's adaptations. Unlike Nathaniel, who relied primarily on face-to-face recruitment at trading posts and churches, Weston developed more sophisticated methods that exploited the territory's growing infrastructure. He began placing advertisements in territorial newspapers seeking domestic workers for Christian households, creating a paper trail that made his recruitment efforts appear legitimate, while actually funneling vulnerable young women into his trap. His advertisements were carefully crafted to appeal to specific types of victims: wanted, Christian young women of good character to serve in godly household. Room, board, and spiritual education provided. Suitable for those seeking refuge from worldly corruption and desiring to serve the Lord's purposes. Apply to W. Bowden, care of Tubac Trading Post. The recruitment process under Weston's leadership became more aggressive and systematic than Nathaniel's original methods. Rather than waiting for suitable victims to present themselves through chance encounters, Weston began actively scouting churches, community gatherings, and even funeral services throughout southern Arizona, identifying vulnerable young women and researching their family situations before approaching them with carefully crafted recruitment pitches tailored to their specific circumstances and vulnerabilities. His success in expanding the operation caught Nathaniel's attention and approval. The older man began considering Weston as his eventual successor in leading what had evolved from a single family's tragedy into a criminal enterprise with religious trappings that now spanned multiple locations and involved dozens of victims at various stages of indoctrination. By early 1855, the two settlements housed 51 people, including 28 young ones under the age of 16 who'd been born into or recruited for the system. The psychological damage inflicted on these young people represented perhaps the most heinous aspect of Nathaniel's crimes. Unlike adult victims who retained some memory of normal life and natural family structures, those born into the settlements knew no reality beyond their father's twisted interpretation of divine authority. They genuinely believed that outsiders were corrupted by sin and destined for damnation. They accepted without question that normal family structures were abominations against God's will. And most tragically, they believed that their own systematic abuse was evidence of their special status as chosen people destined to inherit the earth when God's judgment finally came. Grace Harris's testimony, given after her escape in 1858, provides heartbreaking insight into the mindset of young people raised within this system. I thought all families lived like ours until I was 14 years old and met a girl from Tucson whose father wasn't married to her or her sisters. I asked Mama Autumn why the outside girl's family was so corrupted and broken, and she explained that Satan had convinced most people to reject God's true plan for human relationships and family structure. I felt genuine pity for young people who didn't have fathers who loved them enough to make them wives when they reached the age of spiritual maturity. I thought we were blessed and they were cursed. The normalization of these violations within the settlements was reinforced through elaborate religious ceremonies that celebrated what Nathaniel called divine unions between family members. These ceremonies typically coincided with young women reaching puberty, marking their transition from what Nathaniel termed spiritual infancy to spiritual maturity and readiness for their sacred duties. The celebrations served multiple insidious purposes. They provided religious justification for systematic abuse that might otherwise be recognized as criminal. They created community pressure that made resistance extremely difficult, even for those who harbored doubts. And they established psychological frameworks that presented abuse as privilege rather than victimization, making victims feel chosen rather than exploited. By 1855, the second generation of Nathaniel's victims had begun producing offspring of their own, creating bloodlines so corrupted that genetic analysis would later reveal devastating levels of inbreeding and the resulting health consequences. Medical records from the eventual investigation documented numerous cases of developmental disabilities, physical deformities, and chronic health conditions directly attributable to the systematic incest that Nathaniel had institutionalized as religious practice. The physical and mental health consequences of this systematic inbreeding created additional layers of control as young people born with disabilities became even more dependent on their abusers for basic survival. They couldn't conceive of independence or escape because their conditions made them genuinely reliant on the only community they'd ever known. The expansion of Nathaniel's operation during this period attracted the first serious attention from federal authorities who'd begun investigating reports of organized criminal activity in the remote territories. The U.S. Army had established new outposts throughout Arizona to deal with Apache conflicts, and these military installations brought increased federal presence and oversight to regions that had previously operated with minimal government interference. But the investigation that would eventually expose Nathaniel's crimes was still years away. And in the meantime, his empire of abuse continued to grow with each new victim recruited, each new ceremony performed, and each new life born into bondage that its victims couldn't recognize as such because they'd never known freedom or normalcy. Nathaniel's journal entries from this period reveal a man who'd become completely convinced of his own divine selection and the righteousness of his mission. His writings no longer contained even token acknowledgments that others might view his actions as criminal or immoral. Instead, they read like the confident declarations of a prophet who'd received direct revelation from God and was simply carrying out instructions from the highest possible authority. "The Lord has blessed this work beyond my early visions," he wrote in June of 1855. 2 settlements now flourish under divine guidance, with plans for 3 more within the coming year. The faithful multiply according to God's commandment, and the chosen bloodline spreads as promised. Those who question this sacred work reveal themselves as servants of corruption, and their interference will be met with righteous judgment as the Lord provides direction. The question now was whether the system Nathaniel had created was truly sustainable, or whether the very success of his corruption would eventually generate the evidence and testimony necessary to destroy him. Could an operation this extensive continue to hide in plain sight? Or would its growth inevitably attract the kind of attention that even territorial indifference and community complicity couldn't deflect? The answer would come sooner than Nathaniel expected, triggered not by moral outrage or diligent investigation, but by simple bureaucratic oversight that would accidentally expose his carefully constructed kingdom of horror to federal authorities who had the resources and jurisdiction to pursue justice across territorial boundaries. The telegram that arrived at the Prescott field office of the U.S. Marshal Service on July 19, 1855, contained just 9 words that would change everything. Multiple homicides suspected, religious compound, federal assistance requested immediately. What began as a routine investigation into postal theft would soon uncover the most systematic case of familial abuse in American frontier history, challenging investigators' understanding of how far human evil could extend when protected by isolation, religious authority, and community indifference. The steady click of telegraph keys transmitting urgent messages across copper wires. The acrid smell of coal smoke from wagons carrying federal agents into the Arizona desert. The crisp texture of official documents that would finally give legal weight to years of ignored testimony. These were the elements that marked the beginning of the end for Nathaniel Bowden's criminal empire, though the man himself couldn't yet know that his carefully constructed kingdom was about to crumble. The investigation had been triggered not by concern for his victims, but by the disappearance of a federal postal inspector who'd been investigating reports of systematic mail robbery along the southern Arizona routes. Inspector Daniel Wright had vanished on June 28, 1855, while following leads about missing mail deliveries to remote settlements and ranches. His investigation had led him to question several families about missing correspondence and unusual visitors to the region, eventually directing him toward the Bowden settlement as a possible source of information about criminal activity in the area. Wright's final report, transmitted by telegraph to his supervisor before his disappearance, noted his intention to visit what he described as a large religious community that had established itself in the remote canyon south of Tucson. His report expressed particular interest in investigating claims that this community had grown substantially over recent years, despite being located far from normal transportation routes, commercial centers, or any obvious source of economic opportunity. When Wright failed to report as scheduled on July 1, his supervisor, Chief Inspector Marcus Thornton, initiated the federal investigation that would eventually expose Nathaniel's crimes. Thornton's decision to involve U.S. Marshals reflected the seriousness with which federal authorities viewed threats to Postal Service employees, who were considered representatives of federal sovereignty in the territories. But it also represented the first time that investigators with sufficient resources, legal authority, and jurisdictional reach had taken serious interest in the mysterious activities surrounding the Bowden operations. Authority matters when evil thinks itself untouchable and beyond accountability. The federal investigation team arrived in Tucson on July 26, 1855, led by Deputy U.S. Marshal Hayden Burke, a veteran investigator with 17 years of experience in complex criminal cases across multiple territories. Burke brought with him 3 assistant marshals, a federal prosecutor, a court stenographer, and resources that local territorial authorities had never been willing to commit to investigating the pattern of disappearances that had plagued the region for years. Burke's first action was to locate and interview Sienna, whose earlier testimony to territorial authorities had been dismissed, but whose detailed knowledge of the Bowden settlement made her an invaluable source of information for federal investigators. Sienna's meeting with Burke on July 28 provided the investigation team with their first comprehensive understanding of the scope and systematic nature of Nathaniel's criminal operation. According to Burke's official report, Sienna's testimony was both highly credible and shocking in its implications for federal law enforcement. The witness provides detailed descriptions of the settlement's layout, the systematic recruitment and abuse of young women, the murders of travelers, and the disposal of bodies that can be verified through independent investigation. Her account is consistent, specific, and contains the kind of practical details that would be difficult to fabricate. Most significantly, she provides names and descriptions of other potential witnesses who may corroborate her testimony if they can be located and convinced to cooperate with federal authorities. Sienna's most valuable contribution was her identification of 8 women who'd escaped from the settlements over the years, as well as information about family members of victims who might be willing to cooperate with federal authorities where they'd been unwilling to trust territorial officials who'd dismissed their concerns. She also provided detailed information about Nathaniel's recruitment methods, his travel patterns, his known associates in various towns, and his financial transactions that could be traced through merchants and trading posts. The investigation's first major breakthrough came when Burke's team located and interviewed William Harper, whose daughter Kendall had disappeared in 1853. Harper had kept meticulous records of his daughter's disappearance and his family's frustrating attempts to interest territorial authorities in investigating the case. These records included physical descriptions of the man who'd recruited Kendall, dates and locations of their meetings, copies of the suspicious letter she'd sent after her departure, and detailed notes about other families who'd lost daughters under similar circumstances. What would you do if justice finally had both teeth and the will to use them? Burke's team also benefited from federal resources that territorial authorities had never possessed or been willing to deploy. They could offer witness protection to individuals willing to testify against Nathaniel, relocating them to other territories if necessary. They had authority to investigate across county and territorial boundaries without requesting permissions. They could compel testimony through federal subpoenas. And most importantly, they weren't subject to the local political and economic pressures that had protected Nathaniel from scrutiny for nearly 8 years. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically when Burke's team discovered evidence of Nathaniel's involvement in systematic postal theft and murder of federal employees. Postal inspectors had been investigating the disappearance of mail deliveries to dozens of addresses throughout southern Arizona, suspecting that organized criminals were intercepting shipments containing money, land deeds, or valuable documents. Burke's investigation revealed that many of these thefts were connected to Nathaniel's practice of murdering travelers and stealing their possessions, including any mail they might be carrying for delivery to remote locations. This discovery elevated the investigation from a missing persons case to a federal criminal matter involving multiple violations of postal law, murder of federal employees, interstate commerce violations, and federal statutes governing organized criminal activity. Burke was authorized to expand his team substantially and given resources that would allow for a comprehensive investigation of Nathaniel's entire operation across both settlements. By September of 1855, the federal investigation had identified 63 potential victims of Nathaniel's crimes, including Inspector Wright, whose body was discovered in a shallow grave near the original Bowden settlement on September 12. The discovery of Wright's remains, along with evidence that he'd been tortured before his death, galvanized federal authorities and ensured that the investigation would receive whatever resources were necessary to achieve justice and prevent future crimes. The torture aspect of Wright's murder was particularly significant because it suggested that Nathaniel had been attempting to extract information about federal law enforcement procedures, ongoing investigations, and the identities of potential witnesses who'd spoken to authorities. This indicated a level of criminal sophistication and paranoia that went beyond simple opportunistic violence, and suggested systematic planning to evade federal detection and eliminate potential threats before they could materialize. Burke's team also discovered evidence that Nathaniel had been planning to expand his operation beyond Arizona, with preliminary arrangements made to establish settlements in New Mexico Territory and possibly Southern California. Documents seized from the original settlement during a covert reconnaissance mission revealed detailed plans for recruiting networks that would identify suitable victims throughout the Southwest, creating a regional criminal enterprise that could have affected hundreds of additional families across multiple territories. The federal investigation's progress during the autumn of 1855 represented the first serious existential threat to Nathaniel's criminal empire since he'd established his original settlement 8 years earlier. But Nathaniel hadn't survived for nearly a decade by being careless or naive about threats to his operation. His network of informants in Tucson and other towns had begun reporting unusual questions being asked by federal agents, and by October he understood that he faced investigation by authorities who couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or dismissed as easily as territorial officials had been. His response to this threat would test both his resourcefulness and the investigators' determination to achieve justice before he could either escape accountability or eliminate the evidence and witnesses necessary to convict him of crimes that challenged the legal system's understanding of human depravity on the American frontier. Burke's team knew they were racing against time. Every day that passed gave Nathaniel more opportunity to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, relocate victims, or simply disappear into Mexico, which was less than 50 miles from his settlements. The question was whether federal authorities could move quickly enough to prevent Nathaniel from evading justice one final time, or whether years of patient investigation would ultimately prove insufficient against a man who demonstrated remarkable ability to anticipate and eliminate threats to his twisted vision of divine authority. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, but not in the way that Burke or his team had anticipated. Nathaniel's final act would prove as shocking and calculated as everything else he'd done. demonstrating that some monsters prefer to control their own endings rather than submit to earthly judgment for crimes they genuinely believe were sanctified by divine will. The settlements that federal marshals surrounded at dawn on November 3, 1855, stood eerily silent, their windows shuttered, and their fires cold despite the morning chill. When they finally broke down the doors of the main compound, they found 42 bodies arranged in neat rows within the central meeting hall, each bearing signs of systematic poisoning, administered with the same methodical precision that had characterized Nathaniel's crimes for 8 years. But the man who'd orchestrated this final act of evil was nowhere to be found, leaving behind only a legacy of corruption so profound that its effects would echo through generations of survivors who'd learned to call horror holy. The sharp crack of splintering wood as federal agents forced entry into locked buildings. The sickly sweet smell of decomposition mixed with residual traces of bitter herbs. The unnaturally peaceful expressions on faces that had known only suffering and manipulation in life. These were the sensations that greeted Deputy Marshal Hayden Burke and his team as they entered what had once been Nathaniel Bowden's kingdom of systematic abuse and religious corruption. The scene they discovered challenged every assumption about how such organized evil might finally end. The bodies were arranged according to what appeared to be a carefully planned hierarchy, with Nathaniel's wives and older victims positioned closest to the makeshift altar he'd constructed in the compound's central building. Younger members and newer recruits were placed in concentric circles radiating outward, their positions apparently determined by their length of residence and degree of indoctrination into Nathaniel's twisted theology. Each victim bore evidence of having consumed poison willingly, with no signs of restraint, struggle, or forced administration. Chemical analysis conducted later by territorial physicians revealed that Nathaniel had used a combination of locally sourced plant toxins, primarily derived from Jimson weed and oleander, that would have caused rapid unconsciousness, followed by respiratory failure and death within 15 to 20 minutes. The method suggested both extensive knowledge of poisonous desert plants and careful planning to ensure that his final act would be completed before federal authorities could intervene to prevent the mass death. Some monsters choose their own endings rather than face earthly judgment. The investigation team's discovery of Nathaniel's final journal provided disturbing insight into his mindset during the weeks leading up to the mass poisoning. His entries from October and early November of 1855 revealed a man who viewed federal intervention not as legitimate law enforcement or justice for his victims, but as persecution of God's chosen people by a corrupt earthly authority that refused to recognize divine will and heavenly mandates. The false prophets of secular law seek to destroy what the Almighty has blessed and sanctified through revelation. Nathaniel wrote on October 28, "Rather than allow his sanctified servants to be corrupted by exposure to sinful authorities who serve Satan's purposes, I have received divine instruction to lead them home to their eternal reward in heaven. We go gladly to meet our Creator, confident that our righteousness will be vindicated in His heavenly kingdom, where earthly laws hold no dominion over the faithful." The journal entries revealed that Nathaniel had spent 3 weeks preparing his followers for what he called their translation to glory, conducting elaborate religious ceremonies that convinced them their deaths would be acts of martyrdom rather than murder, and that they would be rewarded in heaven for their faithfulness, while their persecutors would face eternal damnation. His ability to persuade 42 people, including young ones as young as 7 years old, to consume poison, voluntarily demonstrated the complete psychological control he'd achieved through years of systematic manipulation and isolation from any competing worldview. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that not all of the settlement's residents had died in the mass poisoning. Evidence suggested that at least 15 people, including Weston and several other second-generation family members, had left both compounds sometime before the final ceremony. Their absence indicated that Nathaniel's criminal legacy might continue even after his apparent death, and that victims who'd been transformed into perpetrators might establish new operations elsewhere in the vast Western territories. Burke's team launched an immediate manhunt for the missing family members, but their efforts were hampered by the same geographic vastness and limited infrastructure that had protected Nathaniel's operation for so many years. The remote desert terrain provided countless hiding places, and the missing family members possessed extensive knowledge of wilderness survival techniques, desert navigation, and how to avoid detection by authorities that made tracking them extraordinarily difficult. What would you do if evil simply relocated and adapted rather than truly ended? The search for Nathaniel himself proved even more frustrating and ultimately fruitless. Despite extensive investigation of both settlements, the surrounding desert, and possible escape routes into Mexico, no trace of his body was ever found among the compound's victims or in the wilderness areas that search parties covered over subsequent weeks. His final journal entry, dated November 2nd, contained only a cryptic reference to joining the sanctified in their eternal glory, but provided no specific information about his intended fate or location. Some investigators theorized that Nathaniel had consumed poison along with his followers, but had arranged for his body to be hidden or destroyed by the departing family members to prevent desecration by secular authorities. Others suspected that he'd actually escaped the settlement entirely, possibly planning to establish a new operation in Mexico or California, using the knowledge and resources he'd accumulated over 8 years of criminal activity. The uncertainty surrounding his ultimate fate created lasting anxiety among law enforcement officials and survivor communities throughout the territory. Reports of suspicious activities and mysterious disappearances continued to surface for years after the settlement's discovery, though none could be definitively linked to surviving members of the Bowden family or to Nathaniel himself. Some frontier communities reported encounters with groups of pale, unusually behaved young people who spoke in biblical language and seemed unfamiliar with normal social customs. Others told stories of remote homesteads where women outnumbered men by impossible ratios and where visitors were never welcomed or allowed to stay overnight. The federal investigation's final report, completed in March of 1856, documented the most comprehensive case of systematic familial abuse in American frontier history up to that point. The evidence collected from both settlements included detailed records of 78 confirmed murders, extensive documentation of systematic violations involving dozens of victims over multiple years, and financial records indicating theft of over $60,000 from murdered travelers and systematic postal robbery operations. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the medical examinations conducted on the bodies of young people found in the settlements. These examinations revealed evidence of systematic inbreeding that had produced severe genetic abnormalities, developmental disabilities, and chronic health conditions in multiple generations of victims. The physical evidence confirmed testimony from survivors about Nathaniel's practice of arranging marriages between close relatives, as part of his twisted interpretation of biblical patriarchy, and his goal of creating a pure bloodline uncorrupted by outside influence. The psychological impact on survivors proved even more devastating than the physical evidence suggested. The few family members who'd escaped before the final poisoning required years of careful rehabilitation to overcome the indoctrination they'd experienced. Many never fully recovered their ability to function in normal society, remaining permanently traumatized by years or entire lifetimes spent believing that systematic abuse represented divine love, and that their suffering was evidence of special blessing rather than criminal victimization. Dr. Margaret Thornton's follow-up study of Bowden family survivors, published in 1882, documented the long-term effects of cult indoctrination on psychological development and social functioning. Individuals raised within systems that present systematic abuse as religious duty often experience permanent difficulty distinguishing between love and manipulation, between spiritual authority and criminal exploitation. The confusion of sacred and profane concepts creates lasting trauma that affects their ability to form healthy relationships, recognize appropriate behavioral boundaries, or trust religious institutions and authority figures. Some psychological wounds never fully heal because the victims were systematically taught to call them blessings and to interpret their pain as proof of divine favor. Some wounds never heal because the victims learn to call them blessings. The legal proceedings that followed the settlement's discovery established important precedents for federal investigation of organized criminal activity disguised as religious practice. The evidence gathered by Burke's team led to new federal statutes governing cult activities, providing law enforcement agencies with improved tools for investigating similar cases in the future. The case also established legal precedents regarding federal jurisdiction over crimes committed in territories, the rights of cult members versus religious freedom protections, and the responsibilities of communities to report suspected abuse even when it occurs within religious contexts. But the Bowden case also highlighted the profound limitations of legal systems designed to address conventional crimes when confronted with systematic evil that exploited religious freedom protections, geographic isolation, and community complicity. The 8 years that Nathaniel operated with virtual impunity demonstrated how society's willingness to ignore obvious warning signs, prioritize economic relationships over moral obligations, and defer to religious authority could enable criminal enterprises of unprecedented scope and duration. The settlement sites were eventually burned by federal order, and the land declared unsuitable for future habitation. The official justification cited public health concerns related to contaminated soil and water supplies from the mass grave sites, but territorial residents understood the real reason. Some places become so tainted by sustained evil that they can never be truly cleansed, only abandoned to the desert and forgotten by those who want to believe such darkness couldn't exist in their communities. The missing family members were never found, despite investigations that continued sporadically for over 15 years after the settlement's discovery. Their disappearance ensured that questions about Nathaniel's ultimate fate and the potential continuation of his criminal legacy would remain unanswered, creating a mystery that continues to generate speculation and anxiety more than a century and a half later. Even today, residents of southern Arizona occasionally report encounters with isolated communities that practice unusual customs, arrange marriages between close relatives, and speak of their founders as divinely appointed patriarchs. While none of these reports have been definitively connected to survivors of Nathaniel's operation, they serve as reminders that evil of this magnitude rarely disappears completely. It simply adapts, relocates, and finds new shadows in which to flourish away from the light of accountability and justice. The Bowden case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American frontier history, a testament to how isolation, religious manipulation, and community indifference can combine to create conditions where systematic abuse flourishes for years while decent people look away. The 42 victims who died in that final act of mass murder deserved better from the society that failed to protect them. And the survivors who escaped deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals who found the courage to resist and testify, even when the entire system seemed designed to silence them. We're only scratching the surface of the darkness that existed on the American frontier. The next case is even more disturbing. Subscribe before it drops, because these stories need to be told so that the patterns can be recognized and interrupted before they claim more victims in our own time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.